In the mid-1950s, a NATO founding member looked at the Soviet Union's most feared new weapon and decided to build the exact same gun, same gas system, same rotating bolt, same bolt carrier, same 7.460 Tux 39mm cartridge the Red Army had just adopted. It wasn't inspired by the AK-47, it was a copy of it, and it never fired a single shot for any army on Earth. Here's the strange part. This wasn't some rushed knockoff from a country desperate for a weapon. It came from Denmark, a NATO founding member with a serious, century-old arms industry. Engineers who knew exactly what they were doing looked at Mikhail Kalashnikov's rifle, decided it was the best infantry weapon in the world, and set out to build a Western version of it. They got the mechanics right. They got almost everything right, except one detail, a small, almost embarrassing detail that doomed the entire project before it ever reached a battlefield. Hold on to that detail because it explains everything that follows, and here's the promise. This isn't just a story about a forgotten rifle nobody remembers. It's a story about what happens when you copy a weapon's engineering, but miss the reason that engineering worked in the first place. Stick around, because the rifle NATO built to rival the AK-47 is one of the strangest failures in Cold War small arms history. To understand why a NATO country would copy a Soviet rifle, you have to understand what the AK-47 had just done to the entire concept of the infantry weapon. By the early 1950s, the AK-47 wasn't just another rifle in a crowded field, it was a demonstration. Select fire, 30-round detachable magazine, an intermediate cartridge that let a soldier control automatic fire, and a mechanism so forgiving of dirt, mud, and neglect that it became legendary almost immediately. Western observers who got their hands on captured examples weren't dismissive, they were alarmed. And in Denmark, that alarm had a name, Dansk Industri Syndikat, better known by its rifle brand, Madsen. Madsen wasn't a garage operation, it was one of Europe's oldest and most respected arms manufacturers. A company that had been building machine guns and rifles since before the First World War. After 1945, with European militaries rebuilding from scratch, and every arms maker on the continent chasing new contracts, Madsen needed a rifle that could win. So its engineers made a decision that looked on paper unbeatable. Instead of designing something new and risking the years of trial and error every original rifle goes through, they would build directly on top of the design that had already proven itself in Soviet hands. The result was the Madsen LAR, the light automatic rifle. Mechanically, it was almost a direct transplant, a long-stroke gas piston, a rotating bolt and bolt carrier lifted straight from the Kalashnikov system. The internal architecture that made the AK famous for shrugging off sand, freezing mud, and years of abuse. Madsen's engineers weren't guessing at what made the AK reliable. They understood it, and they rebuilt it, piece by piece, inside a rifle wearing a Danish nameplate. The first version was chambered in the exact same round as the AK-47, 7.60 Tux 39mm, not a NATO standard cartridge, the actual Soviet intermediate round. Madsen wasn't hedging. It was betting that the Soviet approach to the infantry rifle, light, controllable, effective at real combat ranges instead of theoretical ones, was simply correct, and that a Western arms company could build the same idea, only better made. On paper, it was everything a modern NATO army could want, a rifle with proven Kalashnikov reliability, built to Western manufacturing standards, offered by a company with real engineering pedigree. In practice, it had a problem, and it wasn't a small one. Here's the detail that undid the whole project. The Madsen LAR could not accept AK-47 magazines. Read that again because it's the entire story in one sentence. A rifle engineered from the ground up to replicate the Kalashnikov system, built around the Kalashnikov cartridge, using the Kalashnikov bolt and gas piston, and soldiers couldn't grab a captured Soviet magazine off a battlefield and drop it straight in. The one thing that made the AK-47 a logistical dream, total magazine interchangeability across an entire Eastern Bloc arsenal, was the one thing Madsen's copy didn't copy. It sounds like a footnote. It wasn't. In a Cold War where NATO planners were obsessed with standardization, a rifle that mimicked the AK's internals but broke its logistics chain solved nothing. It gave a Western army all the manufacturing complexity of a new design with none of the interoperability the original actually offered. But the magazine problem wasn't even the thing that killed it first. Timing did that. Madsen submitted the 7.60 Tux 39mm LAR for military trials in Finland, a country sitting right on the Soviet border with every reason to take the AK-47's design seriously, and Finland already had its own answer in the works, a domestically engineered AK pattern rifle from the state arms factory Valmet, refined specifically for Finnish conditions and Finnish manufacturing. The Madsen LAR lost comprehensively. The Valmet design, which would go on to become the legendary RK-62, one of the most respected AK pattern rifles ever built outside the Eastern Bloc, beat Madsen's rifle in the exact competition Madsen needed to win. A Danish company had tried to out-Kalashnikov the Kalashnikov and lost to a rifle built by people who understood not just the mechanism, but the philosophy behind it. Madsen didn't quit. This is where the story gets even stranger. After losing the Finnish trials, the company scaled the rifle up and rechambered it entirely. This time for the full NATO standard 7.62x50 ONM cartridge. The round the Alliance had just formally adopted in 1954. If the Soviet caliber version couldn't find a buyer, maybe a NATO caliber version would. It was a reasonable pivot. It was also too late. By the time Madsen's rechambered LAR was ready for evaluation, the NATO rifle market wasn't open anymore. Most member nations that used the new 7.62x50 ONM round had already committed to one of two rifles that had gotten there first. Belgium's FNFAL adopted across huge swaths of the alliance, or West Germany's Heckler & Koch G3. Both were proven. Both had momentum, factories, and contracts already signed. There was no takers left in the room. The Madsen LAR never entered serial production. Not for Denmark, not for any NATO ally, not for anyone. Today, only a handful of prototypes survive, sitting behind glass in the Royal Danish Armory Museum in Copenhagen, a rifle built to prove the West could match Soviet engineering. Reduced to a museum curiosity that most people, even firearms historians, have never heard of. Compare that to the fate of the rifle it was trying to beat. The AK-47 went on to become the most produced firearm in human history. Well over 100 million built across dozens of countries. The Madsen LAR built somewhere around 2 prototypes, same core engineering, same cartridge philosophy, completely opposite outcomes. Here's what makes this more than just a story about one failed prototype. Madsen wasn't the only Western attempt to reckon with what the AK-47 had proven. And here's the twist that reframes everything. Some of those later attempts actually succeeded. Israel took the AK's core principles and built the Galil, using a Finnish Valmet action as its starting point. The very same lineage that had beaten Madsen in those Finnish trials, and turned it into one of the most respected battle rifles in the Middle East. Italy's Beretta produced the AR-70. Belgium's FN, the same company whose FAL had helped bury Madsen, later built the FNC drawing on Kalashnikov pattern principles, and even adapted a scaled version of the mechanism into the wildly successful Mini-Me light machine gun. Finland's own RK-62 lineage became one of the most respected rifle families in Northern Europe, still influencing Finnish small arms today. So the lesson of the Madsen LAR isn't that the West couldn't learn from the AK-47. Clearly, eventually, parts of it could, and did, brilliantly. The lesson is narrower and sharper than that. Copying the mechanism was never the hard part. Simonov and Kalashnikov both understood that a rifle isn't just its bolt and its gas system, it's the entire ecosystem around it. The cartridge doctrine, the magazine logistics, the manufacturing timeline, the market you're walking into, and whether anyone still needs what you're selling by the time you arrive. Madsen nailed the metal. It missed the moment, and it missed the magazine, so picture the two of them side by side, the way history actually left them. In the East, the AK-47 became the defining weapon of the 20th century, copied, licensed, and manufactured by nations that understood exactly why it worked, arming everyone from national armies to guerrilla movements across 3 continents in the West. A company that understood the same mechanism just as well built something almost identical. And it sits, unfired, in a museum case in Copenhagen, a rifle that got the engineering right and the everything else wrong. Nobody at Madsen was incompetent. Their engineers reverse-engineered one of the most important weapons of the century with real skill. But being right about the mechanism was never going to be enough, not when the rifle arrived a beat too late for the trials that mattered, and couldn't share a single magazine with the gun it was trying to replace. The AK-47 didn't just win because of what was inside it, it won because everything around it, the cartridge, the supply chains, the sheer scale of production, moved together as one system. Madsen copied the heart and left the rest behind. There's one more irony buried in this story, and it's the kind only history bothers to write. The Soviet Union never worried about Madsen. It didn't need to. While a Danish company was quietly losing trial after trial, the AK-47 was already being handed to the East German Volksarmee, the Polish Army, Hungary, Bulgaria, and eventually dozens of nations far beyond the Warsaw Pact, all of them sharing the same magazines, the same ammunition, the same spare parts. Somewhere in a NATO country, a rifle built to answer that machine sat in a workshop, unable even to borrow a magazine from the weapon it was copying. The imbalance wasn't close. It was never going to be close, and there's a second irony worth sitting with. NATO eventually got its own answer to the Kalashnikov problem, just not from Denmark, and not by copying the gun directly. It came through standardization instead of imitation, first with the 7.62 ohm round Madsen chased too late, and later, by the early 1980s, through the shift to 5.56mm and the S109 cartridge that shaped the MiG-16 and its NATO-wide descendants. The alliance solved the problem the AK-47 posed, just not with a copy at all. It solved it by building its own doctrine from the ground up, the same way the Soviets once had. That's the real difference between a system and a shortcut. The AK-47 wasn't just a rifle. The Soviets happened to build well. It was the product of a cartridge, a doctrine, and a manufacturing base, all pulling in the same direction at the same time. Madsen tried to shortcut straight to the finished product without rebuilding any of the scaffolding underneath it. And a rifle missing its scaffolding doesn't stand on its own for very long, no matter how well the visible parts are made. So picture it one more time. A Danish engineer, sometime in the mid-1950s, machining a bolt carrier that could have come straight off a captured Kalashnikov, confident he had just built the West's answer to the most important rifle of the century. He wasn't wrong about the mechanism, he was wrong about almost everything around it.